they've been following, perhaps would suggest that a less confrontational attitude towards the United States might be better. And so, in this present context, with the situation in Ukraine, situation between Russia and Ukraine, there may be those within the party, even at the leadership levels, who see this as an opportunity to kind of push back against Xi Jinping's orientation, against the kinds of policies and the kinds of positions that he's really staked out. Um, we don't know what the internal debates within the party are. Sometimes we can get glimpses of that in different publications, and you have to do a lot of that sort of close reading and reading between the lines and all. But I would not at all be surprised if there isn't some jockeying and some contention going on. We are in the run-up to the next party Congress, and that will be a really important moment, both in terms of domestic policy and China's ongoing engagement with the wider world. And I think that this is a difficult moment. And we have seen, not only debate within the party, but of course there's been debate in online, even in the media, about this. Some Chinese are quite concerned about the situation. Some Chinese are quite critical and have been outspoken in their criticism of Russia. So I think that it's a moment of political contention. I don't think that we're on the verge of any sort of dramatic upheaval, but I think that it is within the both the internal political conversation in the Communist Party and the broader conversation within Chinese society, both of which are, of course, much more lively and much more uh, substantive than American propaganda would suggest. But in those contexts, I think that there's a lot of discussion going on.
Mao was the undisputed, well, not undisputed, but certainly the central leader of the People's Republic of China from 1949 until his death in the mid 1970s. Then there was the leadership of Deng Xiaoping and several successor governments. And at a certain point, in order to have stability, the Chinese government and the Chinese party adopted rules that said that nobody could be the head of state or the head of the party for more than 2 terms, 2 5-year long terms. And Xi Jinping's term would be up now. He came into office in 2013. So this upcoming Congress, which ironically is called the 20th Party Congress, of course, in communist history, the 20th Party Congress in the Soviet Union was a watershed event after the death of Stalin. But in this 20th Party Congress, if there had not been a change in the rules whereby a leader was there for 2 5-year terms at the max, then there'd be a new leadership coming in. But we don't know whether a new leadership is coming in because as of 2018, the party amended the rules such that if someone wanted to seek a 3rd term, someone being Xi Jinping, that would be legally permissible according to the rules. Now, that suggests, to me at least, Ken, that there is a contention within the leadership, that the Xi Jinping grouping has constituted, as you and I have talked about in the past, a move to the left within China. But there are also those who have pursued and embraced what might be called more of a neoliberal economic model of development, and including a neoliberal model that integrates China in a certain spot or a certain space in the world capitalist economic order. And obviously, if Xi Jinping's line, and there's been also the idea there's something called Xi Jinping thought. In other words, there's amendments to the rules that says that his leadership represents something different, something distinctive. But he would not be seeking a 3rd term at age 70 if that line was completely consolidated. Obviously, his own personal leadership appears to be decisive and significant. And thus, you can see, as you said, by reading carefully or reading in between the lines, that there are this ongoing struggles that there have always existed within the Chinese Communist Party. Uh, Before the revolution, after the revolution, there was, of course, in the 1960s, the two-line struggle that led to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and then the Mao grouping, the so-called Gang of Four, who were arrested following Mao's death, and then Deng Xiaoping's leadership. Anyway, when you think about what's going on, Xi Jinping is closely aligned with Russia, meaning China and Russia have overcome past differences and cemented this historic relationship, two of the biggest countries in the world. Now Russia has done something in Eastern Europe, which is obviously upsetting to China's plans to help integrate parts of Eastern Europe into the Belt and Road Initiative, its own Eurasian-based economic project. Anyway, when we look at all of that, and the way the Western media is obviously aware of the same things I'm talking to you about, they're like poking. They're trying to find, is there a difference? Is there a distinction? Will Xi Jinping feel compelled to condemn Russia? So far, no. I want to read to you like an amazing press briefing that was conducted by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson with, it's Chinese press, but a lot of Western press. Here's the AFP, the French news agency. He says to the Chinese Foreign Ministry official, my question is, given that China has not explicitly opposed Russia's invasion of Ukraine, should we assume that China therefore has no problem with this kind of indiscriminate killing of civilians? President Biden has called President Putin a war criminal. Does China agree that Russia may have committed war crimes in Ukraine? To which the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson says, these are a few sentences long, but I want to read them for our audience and then get you to react. On the Ukraine issue, this is his response. On the Ukraine issue, China has made its view known that the international community should focus on two things, namely peace talks and avoidance of a large-scale humanitarian crisis. We have also made huge efforts in this regard. China has proposed a 6-point initiative on easing the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and has taken real actions. We will continue to provide humanitarian assistance as needed. And then he goes on, I want to stress that China's position on peace talks is consistent. You may refer to China's statements on hotspot issues including Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine. When it comes to civilian casualties and the humanitarian situation, I wonder if you were equally concerned about the civilian casualties in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and in Palestine. Do these civilians mean nothing to you? Do not forget Serbia in 1999 or the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Did you show any care about civilian casualties there? If not, then you are not in a position to make accusations against China. So, this is a very combative position for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which, 20 years ago, you would never hear a press briefing like that from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. It would always be something soft, something appeasing. Anyway, Ken Hammond, you followed this very closely over the years. This is somebody who's in combat, meaning the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
Absolutely. That particular press briefing, that's back on March 17th, and Zhao Lijian, who is the spokesperson that's involved there, throughout that press conference, throughout that press briefing, there are a number of openly hostile questions from the media, and as you say, rather than sort of rolling with the punch and being very accommodating and trying to tamp things down. Zhao Lijian is he's not taking it, and he I think is he reflects the attitude of the Chinese government that these attempts to make China look bad, these attempts to condemn China, to basically say that China might as well be invading Ukraine itself, right? For the attitude that's being adopted by the Western media, and I think that that's interesting in a couple of ways. One is simply that, as you noted a few minutes ago, if you look at the countries that have abstained from or voted against the UN resolutions, although they as the in terms of the number of countries, the number of votes, they don't constitute a majority within the United Nations. The populations that those countries represent are well over half of humanity. So the idea that that the United States and NATO are leading some global alliance with only a handful of sort of miscreants that won't get with the program, this is simply not. It doesn't reflect reality. But that's the message that we hear over and over and over again. Biden is praised in American media, in international Western media, for having united the civilized world in a sense, right? But that simply doesn't reflect the realities of our planet. It's and China comes in very selectively for criticism and condemnation here. India also has abstained. India has recently made massive purchases of oil from Russia. I mean, in the last few days, which are going to be paid for in an interesting rubles for rupees arrangement that's going to bypass the American imposed sanctions. So that's India is always trotted out by Western media spokespersons as the world's biggest democracy, and yet here they are also abstaining, also not wanting to jump on the bandwagon of condemnation. The same is true for a number of other important countries. Brazil, which of course has had a close relationship with the United States and has a very hardly what we would think of as a progressive or radical left government right now, has also abstained. South Africa has abstained. A number of African countries have abstained. Pakistan has abstained. There's a number of the number of important states around the world that have tried to take a more neutral, a more nuanced position on this is significant. So that's one aspect, that the portrayal of China as sort of the problem or the issue or the one country that isn't towing the line here, that's just not accurate. But the other aspect of this, for especially for the Western media, but for Western politicians as well, is just as again, as Zhao Lijian noted in his response to the AFP question. What about Afghanistan? What about Iraq? What about Syria? What about West Africa? What about the Philippines? All these areas in the world where the United States is involved in ongoing military operations, and especially in the big theaters in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, where there have been massive civilian casualties, the destruction of entire villages. Where are the pictures of that? Where's the oh so emotionally engaged voices of NPR reporters? Why aren't we hearing that? Why didn't we hear that in 20 years of destructive warfare in Afghanistan? You know, when the American government is the aggressor, when the American government is the invader, when the American government is responsible for the deaths of civilians and the destruction of infrastructure and residential neighborhoods and things like that, the American media is remarkably silent. No images, no heart-wrenching stories, no throat-catching narratives. But when it's Ukraine, here we have this day by day, 24/7, relentless coverage That is, of course, it's heart wrenching. No one wants to see this. No one wants to have these events taking place. And China has been very clear in its call for the end of hostilities and for the return to negotiations. So the manipulation of public opinion by the media and by politicians, I think has been stark, and it's been such a strong contrast to the kind of you know, uh, go along and get along attitude that the press had towards the American government in these conflicts that have unfolded over the last 20 years and more.
Yeah, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson picks up just on what you're saying as well. Again, and talks about racism. I mean, and again, this is distinctively different than the way China was talking 25 years ago. Uh, Maybe it wasn't different in the 1960s when China was in a very left, sort of phase of its own uh, internal struggle and its political orientation towards world imperialism. But here again, I want to just read a couple more sentences from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, and again responding to that AFP person. But there's many other Western media. I'm not. They're typical. They're not atypical. China's position is above board, objective, and just. But the US, NATO, and some Western media are very hypocritical, especially as some reports smack of racism. We suggest some media focus more efforts on things that are actually conducive to promoting peace. They may advise the US and NATO countries not to supply ammunition or to add fuel to the flame, but to sit down and build peace by talking with Europe, talking with Russia and Ukraine. And he's not wrong, Ken. I mean, what the Chinese are saying basically is, look, we care a lot about the Ukrainians. We want peace in Ukraine. We highlight it, but we also talk about the Afghans and the Yemenis and the Syrians and the Iraqis. And before that, China, which has a long and storied history with Africa, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, where the U.S. carried out regime change and murder and assassination. And he's right. The Western media turns a blind eye to almost all of that. Partly it's because the victims are the victims of the U.S. government, the victims of U.S. imperialism, but partly it's because of racism. And you can even hear in the Western media, they're talking about the civilized world, as if, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Ukrainians who, quote, as some of the reporters say, look just like the people who might be our neighbors. And the fact that this is happening, and that this isn't the Middle East, this isn't South Asia, this isn't Africa, as if that would be just understandable and typical and not such a big deal in those parts of the world. But for Ukrainians and for white Europeans, a very, very big deal. I mean, the Chinese, in a way, it makes me, it's a bit reminiscent when China helped form the non-aligned movement in the 1950s with the Bandung conference, and China was representing the third world, so to speak, that it was a developing, emerging country. Anyway, let's just talk about that, and then I want to go back to the issue of China-Russian relations coming up before this 20th Congress in China. Of course, and we've talked about this in the past, in 1950, Chairman Mao left China for the first time, the only time he ever left China, and he came and met with Stalin, and there was months of negotiations and at that time the Soviets and the Chinese formed a friendship alliance, and it became sort of a fundamental axis of global politics in that period or that time of the world. Anyway, even though obviously in Russia there's not a communist party that's a ruling party, Putin is not a communist. In fact, he's an anti-communist according to all of his speeches of recent time. But they have found themselves again, not necessarily for ideological reasons, but as allies against a common foe. Go ahead.
Well, that's a very important point to pay some attention to, because China and Russia today have very different social and economic and political systems. This isn't although it'd be hard to tell from some Western media accounts, this isn't a return to the socialist bloc or something like that. I think we've talked a lot about the idea that we are in an era of a kind of new Cold War. Um, but that's largely a matter of the American hostility directed towards China. Uh, the relationship between China and Russia is one that's based on very practical, down to earth foundations, economic ones, geopolitical ones, and the desire, as we talked about a little earlier today, that both countries have not to be dominated by the United States, not to be dominated by the sort of Atlantic powers, right? Um, so I think that's the context in which we need to think about the Chinese Russian relationship. It is not an ideological alliance. It's not a common political front pursuing some sort of global agenda, but it is a relationship between two neighboring countries that have many common interests, many things that they can do together, which will be mutually beneficial. But they have differing systems, and sometimes they're going to have differences in policy and differences of opinion. And I think right now we can see that relationship, while it is close and while it's important and functional for both sides, can also have its stresses and its difficulties. I think has been as again as Zhao Lijian says over and over and over in his press briefings, China has been consistent in their positions on the situation in Ukraine, and their position on Ukraine is consistent with Chinese foreign policy principles, which were enunciated back in the 1950s and have been maintained ever since. Non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity. Now, on one level, if you actually listen to and take seriously what people say, when China reiterates over and over again that it is committed to respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, that's not to point the finger at Russia and say you're committing aggression, we condemn your actions, but it certainly raises the point that China doesn't believe anyone should be doing that. Russia, we have to acknowledge, is doing that. They are not respecting the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine right now. There are reasons they have been provoked over the past few decades by the relentless expansion of NATO, by the clearly hostile policies directed towards Russia by the U.S. and NATO, the European Union. So it's not as though this situation doesn't have its historical roots, but China's very clear that it is for a stop, for hostilities to be taken to the negotiating table, and for an agreement to be reached between the contending parties. That too is consistent with their approach diplomatically to problems all over the world. And again, Zhao Lijian points that out in his comments.
One of the things that's also noteworthy about the long statement that was signed between Russia and China when Putin was in Beijing for the Olympics. Again, it's 5,000 word long statement. People should get the statement and read it. Unfortunately, we only hear what the U.S. media says about Russia or about China, but people should really take the time to get their hands on the documents and read them for themselves, and they're very, very illuminating. I want to read a couple more sentences, Ken, to you from that statement, because again, it's a window into the thinking of China and to Russia, because this is a joint statement. And when you hear some of the things they're highlighting about why they're developing a relationship, which they say is a relationship without limits, uh, and even that term can be misinterpreted about what that means. It's not like we're in love and now we're getting married and our love is going to be deeper and deeper and deeper, and who knows, it has no limits. It's really about, it can extend to all these different areas of life. That's what it means, a relationship without limits, not like boundless love, but rather that it can be in many, many different areas. Again, that's something that's been misinterpreted, I'd say, by the Western media. But I want to read to you what it is, because it's clear that they're addressing a common problem that they have. Here we go. Russia and China stand against attempts by external forces to undermine the stability in their common adjacent regions, that intend to counter interference by outside forces in the internal affairs of sovereign countries under any pretext, to oppose color revolutions, and will increase cooperation in the aforementioned areas. Now, let's just dissect that for people. They're talking about that the US or Western external powers are using pretexts in the adjacent areas of both Russia and China to undermine the stability of those countries, and that they both oppose color revolutions. Now, let's, again, for the maybe somebody who's watching this show for the first time, let's just break down. Both Russia and China are upset, worried about color revolutions and external forces using struggles in adjacent areas. I mean, these have very particular meanings. Let's break it down for the audience.
Sure. When we talk about adjacent areas, when that statement talks about adjacent areas, and that statement is a remarkable document. It is so comprehensive. It covers so many areas. I agree with you that people should get that and read it, as is often the case, so that they have a direct understanding of exactly what's in there, and not just these sort of very carefully selected bits that the Western media and politicians focus on. But when we talk about adjacent areas and about color revolutions, these are of course they're two sides of the same coin. For China, we look at, for example, the provocations that are carried out routinely by the United States naval forces in the South China Seas, or even more close to home, by sailing back and forth through the Taiwan Strait, which is clearly the territorial waters of China. And both the government of the PRC and the local authorities on Taiwan are very clear about that. There is one China. Taiwan is part of China. The Taiwan Strait is the territorial waters of China, but the U.S. Navy sails back and forth there, pretty much at will, and the PLA doesn't fire on them or stop them, which I think is remarkably restrained on their part. But that's those kinds of adjacent territories. Southeast Asia, American efforts to try to enlist some of the ASEAN countries in the sort of containment and encirclement policies that the U.S. is pursuing as part of its so-called pivot to Asia. Central Asia, the countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, where American political operations take place, trying to foment a color revolution or regime change, however we want to talk about it. The recent events in Kazakhstan, perhaps being yet another example of that. And for the Russians, of course, it's Eastern Europe. When the Cold War came to an end, and the fraternal socialist states in Eastern Europe went through their own political transitions. There were certainly understandings, perhaps not committed to formal treaty agreements, but certainly understandings and undertakings on the part of